You also talk about how race is merely cosmetic. Aren't you insulting all the intelligent people here and the 80% of African Americans who are Democrats by claiming that the current Democratic Party has anything to do with that Dixiecrat party from 50 years ago that was trying to stop them from voting? Aren't you conflating the word Democrat with progressive? They have utterly nothing to do with each other. The current Democratic Party has absolutely none of those values from 50 years ago, and you're pretending that they are guilty of something. Aren't you trying to claim that Jesse Jackson is a dupe and shouldn't be supporting the Democratic Party because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and freed the slaves?
Let me try to tackle that very frontally. First of all, probably the biggest thing going for the big switch that I mentioned earlier are two facts, both of which are very powerful. The first is that whites in the South, who used to be Democrats, do now predominantly vote Republican. Yep. Right? Fact number two is that blacks who used to vote Republican now vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Yep. And operating on the assumption, which I think is reasonable, that people understand where their own interests lie, it would certainly be right that blacks currently see their identification and their interest in the Democratic Party. Now, here are two interesting questions to ask. Number one, when did blacks switch from being Republicans to being Democrats? The Democratic Party was the party of the Dixiecrats all the way through the 60s. And if what you say is true, that the blacks made a switch to their racial friends, it would appear that the black switch would have to come in the 70s and 80s, when blacks see these racists are now moving over there, so it makes sense for us to move over here. But in reality, blacks moved overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party in the 1930s. The black vote went from about 15% Democratic to about 70% Democratic within 4 years.
In places they could vote.
That's right, but
which was the North.
Also in the
Jackie Robinson was a Republican for darn good reason.
That's absolutely right. But here's what I'm getting at.
Wouldn't be today.
We can debate Jackie Robinson because it's always difficult to know what dead people would say. If Martin Luther King were alive today, Martin Luther King isn't alive today. Okay, but here's the point I'm getting at. The reason that blacks switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party had everything to do with the benefits of the New Deal and nothing to do with racism. In fact, yes, and in the South, too, blacks switched to the Democratic Party. It's not that blacks couldn't vote in the South. It's that there were all kinds of barriers to black voting. Under FDR, there was blacks couldn't vote in the South at all. No blacks voted in the South.
Very, very few.
How many? How many?
I don't know.
Okay. I thought so. Look, there were all kinds of poll taxes and barriers imposed by the Democrats on the black vote until the Democrats realized that they could get the black vote by offering jobs, welfare, retirement programs. Are you telling me that FDR in the South was telling blacks who were voting for the Democrats, you can't vote? Not true. Not true. Blacks in the North and the South switched to the Democratic Party because of New Deal benefits. Many of them were very sad about doing it because they were leaving the party of emancipation and Lincoln and flinging themselves into the party of the Ku Klux Klan and the Dixiecrats who were in the South and were in the Democratic Party. Exactly. So what I'm saying is it was a Faustian bargain in which you get economic benefits and at the same time you're in bed with the racists and you're on your own team. And I'm saying that's American history. Now, whites began to switch to the Republican Party, but much later. Whites began to switch to the Republican Party in droves in the 70s and 80s. Now, here's the point. If you look at racial opinion in the South, and there's a voluminous body of data on this, as racism in the South dramatically declines, the Southern identification with the Republican Party begins to increase. There's an opposite track. Racism is declining in the South, and whites begin to move to the Republican Party. In fact, two scholars who've written a book about this trace that the least racist Southerners all became Republicans. That the racist, the poor white racist Democrat never became a Republican. He was a dug-in Democrat to the end of his days. So the Democratic Party remained the party of racism. And as the South became less agrarian, more prosperous, industry came to the South, the post-industrial society, the Republican appeal of equal opportunity, free markets, prosperity, appealed to Southerners, and that's why they... So what I'm getting at is that the progressives have sold the South on a guilt trip. Even this whole thing about, the Civil War was really about slavery and the South did slavery. Wait a minute. Again, the Northern Democrats protected slavery. The Civil War, the fight over slavery, was between the Democratic Party, North and South, that protected it, and the Republican Party, which only was in the North, that opposed it. That's what that fight was about. It wasn't just... The North-South thing is now a disguise to hide the responsibility of a major political party that was the party of slavery for 100 years. True or false?
Quite frankly, I was a little intimidated to even debate Jesse Jackson at all because I had seen the man perform, he's a terrific speaker. He has unbelievable facility in the use of iambic pentameter. He speaks in rhymes. I may be well-dressed, but I'm still oppressed. I felt kind of intimidated. But nevertheless, we got up there, and we got into this debate about America, and I realized that this was a debate about our own experience. We were both talking about the way America looked to us. Now, the weird thing about it is that if I were to hold my hand up alongside his, our skin color is almost exactly the same. And yet, as we were speaking, as we were debating, I realized that we have two totally different perspectives on America. I began by saying to him, I said, Reverend Jackson, look, I don't deny that racism is real, and in a big country like America, if you look hard enough, you're going to find examples of it. I said, but show me a racism today that is strong enough to keep you or me or your kids or my daughter from achieving the American dream. Where is that kind of racism? Show it to me. Very interestingly, he replied by saying, Dinesh, I can't show it to you, but that doesn't mean anything because the racism that I'm talking about is no longer overt. It is in fact now covert. It's hidden racism. And in fact, the racism has kind of gone underground. And yet, it operates no less powerfully to keep those of us who are persons of color from achieving our American dream. Invisible racism. And as I listened to this, and I'm sitting down, and initially I thought that this was a little bit deranged. But I then began to ask myself, I think, a more interesting question. Why is it that the two of us, who look, you might say, the same, why do we see America so differently? Why is it the case, it's like two of us are sitting at a restaurant and we see an accident, it's the same fact on the ground, and yet we give two completely different and in fact contradictory accounts of it. How is that actually possible? And then I realized as I thought about that what actually seemed to be going on is something a little deeper. That in fact what was really happening is that Jesse Jackson and I were reflecting two completely different perspectives. I'm going to call it on the one hand the immigrant perspective, and on the other hand the perspective of an indigenous minority who has been in this country for a long time. Now, what is the immigrant perspective? Well, the immigrant perspective is, the immigrant is a guy who has actually lived in another country. He's actually a product of another world. And so the immigrant is in a position to compare America to some other existing society. The immigrant is naturally, you might say, someone who is going to engage in this kind of actual comparison. I realized in debating Jesse Jackson that he was not actually comparing America to anything. He wasn't saying that things are really bad in America, but they're much better someplace else. In fact, if there was a standard of comparison that he was using, you'd have to call it utopia or the Garden of Eden. And basically his point was that comparing America to the Garden of Eden, perfection, America falls short. The immigrant, on the other hand, using a comparative or historical standard, was actually talking about other existing societies, other real countries and real ways of life. And so this appeared to be part of the reason why the two of us were seeing America so differently. It's very easy when you're born in America to say things like, all cultures are equal. This is called cultural relativism. No culture is better or worse, superior or inferior to any other. I've read this in innumerable sociology textbooks. And I would like to believe it. But I actually know that my own life is a decisive refutation of it, as is the life of every immigrant who has come voluntarily to the United States. I'm not talking about refugees who come because they have to. But any immigrant who's coming voluntarily is voting with his feet in the most decisive way possible against his own existing culture and in favor of another culture. Now remember that there is an incredible strong natural bias against doing this. I mean, we're born into a world. It's the only world we know. It's the world of my family, my friends, my school. Everything that matters to me is in that world. What would it take for a guy like me to have to leave it and go someplace else? Why the heck would I even think of doing that if I thought that the other culture was just the same as the place I started? It's not better. It's not worse. It's only different. The very fact that I do it means I'm looking for something better. I'm voting, as I say, in the most decisive way I know how, in favor of this new culture. For me, it's better. It's a better life. And America is that kind of a magnet. The reason we're having an immigration debate is that everybody knows that if we basically take down the invisible wall, we don't really have a wall, but if we had a wall, we took the wall down, half the world would come here. America remains the greatest of all magnets. And that means it actually has a legitimate claim, not based on some chauvinistic proclamation, but based on the actual experience of human beings on planet Earth. It has a claim to being some kind of an exceptional society. American exceptionalism.